Pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers joining us live for this special presentation brought to you by Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, Watch a Movie on Us series. This is a conversation with Georgia Popplewell, a Q&A with Shola Lynch, writer and director of Free Angela and All Political Prisoners. As we conclude this Watch a Movie on Us series with this powerful documentary, I'd like to take this time to remind everyone that Free Angela and All Political Prisoners is still available to stream until 11:59 p.m. today at ttfilmfestival.com/watch a movie on us. Written and directed by Shola Lynch, this film is a tribute to Angela Davis, a radical political activist and leader who spent 5 decades as an intellectual campaigning for racial justice and respect for Black lives in the US and the African diaspora. Her work around issues of gender, race, class, and prisons has influenced social movements for generations. Now, Shola Lynch is an award-winning filmmaker best known for that feature documentary, Free Angela and All Political Prisoners. And she's the Peabody Award-winning documentary, Chisolm 72, Unbought and Unbossed. Her independent film body of work and her other collaborative projects feed her passion to bring history alive with captivating stories of people, places, and events. Now, since 2013, she's also served as the curator of the Moving Image and Recorded Sound Division of the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And in 2016, Shola became a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences. Now, moderating our discussion with Shola this afternoon is Georgia Popplewell, and she's a Trinidadian writer and media producer and managing director of the international citizen media project Global Voices. She's worked in independent media since 1989 and has written extensively on culture, music, film, and sport. She started her career at the pioneering Trinidad and Tobago television production company, Banyan, and is a founding member of Earth Television. She has worked on productions such as the Nickelodeon preschool series Gullah Gullah Island and has helmed the production team for the feature documentary 25 Years of West Indies Cricket. In 2005, Georgia started Caribbean Free Radio, the Caribbean's first podcast. Now, throughout this session, we welcome your questions. So at any time, please feel free to use our comment section below to log your question, and we'll have them answered later during our Q&A segment of the presentation. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you and welcome Georgia and Shola. Hi, Georgia. Hi, Shola.
Hi.
I'm unmuted.
There we go. Right. That is what it's all about. Unmute yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's called audio visual, right? So I just wanted to say hi to everyone watching and say hello to Shola, who I actually, this for me is take 2 with Shola. I had the pleasure of doing the Q&A when the film was screened in 2013 at the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival. So it has been an absolute delight to have to watch it again and you know, be able to engage with the really gripping story that is this documentary presents. I also should add that Shola has very deep roots in Tobago.
Yes, absolutely. Shout out to my Tobago family. I hope you're listening and watching.
Great. Shola, as many people who screen the film online these past days will probably not have know much about its background. Maybe we could start with a bit of history and talk a bit about your relationship with the material, with this particular episode in history and your journey toward making this film.
Sure, absolutely. First, I want to thank the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival for selecting Free Angela to screen, and Chanel for the introduction, and Georgia. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So it's a real pleasure. You know, this film came after my film about Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman elected to Congress in the United States, and she runs for president in 1972. So I had gotten to know the 70s, and the 70s, like today, is this period in American history and world history where there is the possibility of great change coming out of the civil rights movement and the youth movements of the 60s. And so I got to know Angela Davis's story just as background. And then I thought, wow, you know, here's this woman at a time when most Black people were found guilty through their trials, and she was acquitted. What is this story? Who is this woman? What was this movement? And I realized that I didn't know much about it, that I knew of her beautiful face, you know, that face that became the icon of political activism throughout the world, but I didn't know the story, and I definitely didn't know the woman. And she was still around to tell it. So that became my mission, to connect with Angela, to interview her, and to dig deep into the story.
How long did it take? From the
Years.
moment you started to
years. I can't even remember how many years. You know, it's like, I don't know, being an artist is a little like being obsessed. You get an idea and you're thinking about something that doesn't exist in the world, and then you write about it, you talk about it, you galvanize interest, you put together a team, you raise money.
Yeah,
The worst part. Yeah, exactly. And then you actually have to produce it. And in the end, you create this cultural artifact that lives in the world beyond that initial release, beyond that moment. And that's particularly the case with historical works. This film, Free Angela and All Political Prisoners, with what's going on in the United States, around the world, the pandemic and the push for Black lives mattering, and that movement again has seen a real resurgence. And it connects us with our foremothers and fathers. You know, we don't stand here alone, right? We stand connected to the folks that, in a sense, paved the way and made it possible for these moments today.
Absolutely. And I was thinking back to the first time I saw it, and the fact that it was released in 2012, which was the kind of moment of Occupy, it was the Arab uprising, and I came across an interview with Angela Davis from TIFF. It premiered at Toronto International Film Festival, where she talked about those things. And she actually, there's this quote I have from her that's actually really interesting. She said, "It's important to convey to new generations that it's possible to join together and feel solidarity and togetherness across racial, ethnic, economic, gender, and national borders. We could use some of that today." And of course, it's kind of like, you know, a description of what's happening now. You say the film has kind of.
Can I actually, before we move on to that, that is
Sure.
you know, that's a really astute quote of hers. I mean, so one of the things that I expected her to be was angry. Right?
She had the right to be, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
angry. I expected her to be impatient and, you know, kind of the stereotype of what a political activist is. And one of the things that I took away from making the film and from her, and she says this at the end of the film, and it is instructive for every one of us in our lives. She said, you know, the Free Angela movement, the work against imprisoning Black bodies unjustly, was the way we were living our lives, right? It wasn't like this one victory, we're done, move on, we spend our lives in another way. That activism, speaking truth to power, you know, finding your moral center and acting out on it is a way of life. And if you look at her life, that is exactly how it is proceeded. And there isn't any one of us listening who can't take that advice to heart, right? You know, we've all, whether we're teachers, firefighters, government officials, journalists, you know, there are moments where we have to consider moral questions and how we'll walk forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A line that stood out for me in the film, that's actually a quote from her, she says at one point that the fight can be won. And the events in the film take place in 1972. 1977 to 72 is a period it covers, more or less.
Yes.
And here we are, 2020, appearing to fight the same battles, be fighting the same battles.
I don't know if they're the same battles, though.
Well, yeah. Tell me, yeah.
Yeah.
That. What is, see, kind of like that, the shift that has taken place for you? What does it feel like, especially having been so immersed in the material to make this film?
Right. Like, I think change is slow when we talk about historical change. And so what we imagine as, oh, nothing is happening, there's no movement. 20, 30 years later, there is movement. And it happens based on what had happened prior. So for instance, the movements of the 60s wouldn't have been possible without what Martin Luther King and the quote unquote traditional civil rights movement did. And they were based on a labor movement that came before them in, the 30s and 40s. And so it's based on the activism of the 60s and 70s where, we gained all this, we gained so much culturally, and it didn't necessarily stick politically, right? And then there was a political shift to a more conservative. And now, because the cultural work was done before, there's things that we can see in terms of justice and injustice that we couldn't see before. I mean, it is incredible to me that in that film, what Angela really is getting involved in is the unjust prisoning of Black men, right? Yeah. But it was invisible to most of the population, and then coming out of Free Angela, she talks about abolishing prisons. Like, that was crazy talk, right?
Yeah.
But now we're all, everyone is like, yeah, let's defund, the police. Let's think about alternative prison. And it wouldn't have been possible without that group of people prior. So, we're not guaranteed to see our success, but we have to pass the baton for our children and grandchildren.
Absolutely. And tell me what's happening with film. I know it's on lists like all those things you should read, anti-racist, reading and film list. Is it, what's actually going on with it? Are you seeing like a real kind of like a resurgence in interest in it directly?
Yes, absolutely. That it's been on a lot of lists. It's been getting a lot of attention. Here we're having this screening. I mean, this film came out in 2012. The fact that it has legs almost a decade later is pretty incredible. And that speaks to, I think, this moment around Black Lives Mattering and the movement. And, the movement really is about voice. And it's not as though the diaspora haven't had voice. So let's be clear on that. Like, we always have something to say. We can, articulate the issues, the needs, et cetera. But it's our counterparts in the broader culture hearing us, right? And when you have a film that is based around finding and articulating in a nuanced, complicated way with a great theme song and fabulous imagery, a woman's voice, it never goes out of style, right? So if you don't know Angela Davis, you can see the film, get to know her through her own words, and judge what you think about that story and take away what you will, and grapple with it. She's a philosophy professor. She dares you to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And speaking of story, it was interesting on this viewing, even though I know how it ends, it was still this gripping story where towards the end, even though intellectually I know what's gonna happen, there was that real kind of like force to the story, and a kind of moral force that you kind of feel that was quite incredible. And I think it's a story that for me, certainly it was a story that was new. And I imagine that there's a whole generation, for whom it was new in 2012, and then there's like a half generation for whom it's new now again.
No, absolutely. And, that's where I have to shout out to the craft of filmmaking. I mean, one of the things that we talked about in the editing room, and I worked with two editors. One, Marion Monnier, she's a French editor who had worked on Carlos, which was a series that had been done by Canal Plus, really smart woman. And then Louis Erskine, who is an American editor, and his most recent work is on Miles Davis, and working with Stanley Nelson. And so and the assistant editor, Sheila Shirazi, and archive footage,
a lot to wrangle.
Yes. And so we talked about is bringing the emotion alive. I mean, I think that what sometimes gets lost in history is we get focused on the facts without the kind of philosophical reflection So somebody lives in a historical moment, it's not obvious what they're going to do next, right? And so that tension, that emotion, they don't know how it's going to work out. And sometimes how we teach history to students is like, oh yeah, so-and-so did this. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress, and it strips away agency. It strips away the all of the emotional integrity and the brilliance and the strategy and the intellect. And the same for this story about Angela Davis. She was cast as a terrorist and as a mastermind in a conspiracy to kidnap a judge to release her quote unquote boyfriend from jail. Now she's a philosophy professor, right? A near PhD. And this is the narrative that the prosecution crafts for this 26-year-old intellect, European trained academic, right? But that's the 70s.
That's the 70s, indeed. Let's talk now about the representation of Black people in the industry. 2016, you're invited to join the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which kind of came, we know what, there was that moment when the kind of Oscar So White movement kind of like pushed against the lack of inclusion. And now there are a lot more people of color in the Academy. We did see the last Oscars that didn't necessarily like translate into representation in the award scenario. But what changes have you seen?
Well,
is it significant?
So I definitely have to shout out the documentary branch. I mean, we are the most diverse branch in the Academy. And the folks with our governors and on the executive committee, which I was lucky enough to serve on in the first year, it is a priority. And it's also one of the spaces where there are more people of color. The issue in our industry is that the budgets are small, so you can have they're more diverse. There's more diversity of producers and directors, et cetera. Our problem within the business is sustaining the ability to keep creating. It's not that it's easy to make one film, right? But it's hard to make your second film and then to keep making films and to sustain yourself and make a living as you grow older. In the business, right? And so that really is the biggest issue. But those of us in the documentary branch, we think about it, and we are trying to bring people along and connect people and bring more people into the fold. But you have to remember, the branch itself is only a couple hundred people, so it's not a lot of people. It is rarefied air all across the board. And so what happens with Academy voting is the branches vote first, which gets you to the short list. And then it's opened up to the entire Academy, right? Mm-hmm. And so, that's a different demographic. And so that's where you start to see what happens with the awards. So it takes time.
Yeah. Do you think this moment we're in is going to give an extra push to that? And I have a friend in the UK who works in film curation, and she said she's never had more job offers in these last 2 months.
Yeah, and I think that's the place to start. I mean, really, it's like to look behind the camera and to see. I think we need more executives greenlighting more diverse stories, because often what happens, and this happened with the Angela Davis story. So I pitch, I raise money. I ran into a fundraising roadblock in the United States. I just so happened through some conference to connect with some French producers, and they were like, we think we really can raise some money. And I had raised maybe $100,000, $200,000, but these films cost, close to $1 million to make.
Yeah.
And they were able to about a third of the budget in France. Now we're talking. So I could leverage all of that in the United States. And it was a female executive at BET at the time, she's no longer there, who said, this is ridiculous. This is an important story. I'm going to make you whole, And so I really think that we all so many people want to be in the camera. I get that, there's power there, but think about behind the camera, think about executives, lawyers to support support the work because it's a team that gets these stories out, for sure.
Absolutely. We see the list of credits at the front of the film.
Yeah.
As with most films nowadays. I mean, it's really like a single company.
Yes, and that's another good point. The higher the budget that gets, when you're a director and you're a woman of color, the feeling initially is, well, can she manage that budget? Can she manage the number of people, right? Because directing from a finance side is about money management, right? It's not about creativity. We get into it because of creativity, and we have to learn the business, because the only way to fulfill your dream, right, to go from vision to actuality, is also to have a sense of the business and or partner with people who have that sense. There's really no other way.
Absolutely. We actually have a question coming in that kind of like steals the next question I was going to ask you, and it's a question I asked you in 2013. But I will let Robert McFarlane, who is in the UK, he would like to know the process you had for choosing what elements of Angela's story to keep out of the film and what you had to leave out. And I'll tack mine on once you answer this.
Sure. So I mean, I had to be true to the narrative of what happened. I specifically addressed this period from 70 to 72 as opposed to a traditional biography, because there's too much and I could only raise enough money for maybe 90 minutes. Mm-hmm. So unless you want me to talk like this, right, that's not how we want to experience 90 minutes. And so it became, I focused on how Angela Davis became this political icon. She's a graduate student. She's kind of nerdy. She's shy. She's a little awkward. She's not the front person. How does it happen? What are the events? What are the choices that she made? And what were the intended and unintended consequences? And I think when you posit history in that way, it's fascinating. And it was becoming a thriller, right? I love, Georgia, that you said you were watching it, you knew what was going to happen, you felt like, I don't know what, you're in the moment of becoming. And that was what was really important, because, not to bring it back to slavery, but there's so much about Black American history, you all are better in the Caribbean by far, is that we don't know our foremothers and fathers. We don't know our stories. And so our history is a way of creating that family and that legacy and that sense of, yeah, this is where I come from. This is where I come from. The pride, so.
And to tack my question on to Robert's, I remember asking you in 2013 when you knew that the film was complete, because you'd said that you'd done a preliminary cut and you knew that it just wasn't, and others might have been encouraging you to kind of lock it, but you knew it wasn't done. And then I don't remember what you said, so I would like you to talk a bit more about.
Sure.
With archive and interview, and there are a couple of reenactments in it that actually are really subtly done, so you don't even realize they are sometimes. But with that kind of material, you really, it's like not a jigsaw puzzle, because there's only one way to put those together, but there are like so many different ways that you can tell this story.
It's like a collage. It really is a collage of interviews and archival, and we created images where we couldn't find footage, and so kind of bringing that all together to create some kind of emotional truth that is accurate to a historical moment. And all of that has to come together, and the only way to do it is in the editing room. I script, I write, I prepare, we get in there, and then you string it out, and it's terrible. And you just have to be honest, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things I learned from my father, Professor Shola Lynch, the academic. You need to be able to edit, and you need to be honest, face the fact that it needs more time. And there are things. The story was very complicated and layered, and there's still so much more to tell, but I had to kind of reduce it to its right. Is every fact in there? No. But is the truth in there? Yes.
Agreed. We have a comment from Marielle Brown, who says, I so appreciate hearing about the practical, financial, and creative, about how the practical, financial, and the creative have to work hand in hand. So, yeah, no, I agree. That's always, for us who work in the industry, that is a really important information to have. And Marielle is asking if you could tell us a bit more about the team you put together.
Sure. So I will say about the comment first that nobody sets out to make a bad film. Nobody is like writing in their proposal, I want to raise money to make a really crappy film that no one cares about. So everybody starts off wanting that, right? And then there's the execution and how it all comes together. I was really lucky with my team. Well, I guess no, let me not say that's luck. I like to choose strong people who are going to help me be better in the storytelling. So I had very strong editors, really strong researchers. And in terms of cinematography, I worked with Sandy Sissel, who had done the interviews for Chisolm, and Bradford Young, who had shot this beautiful film directed by Dee Reese, Pariah. And called him in to do the recreations. I wanted images. It's not recreations. When we hear the word recreation, we think like bad TV. That's not what I'm trying to. I'm trying to evoke an emotional truth, right? And he came into the office. We sat down, and he said, "Shola, you don't remember me." I said, "What? Remember you? Oh no. Okay." He goes, "Yeah, when I was at Howard, you were an associate producer, a co-producer on a production, and you hired me to be your gaffer and PA." And I said, were we nice to you? He said, yeah, that's why I'm here today. And so we sat down, and he has gone on to, he shot Han Solo, he was Selma. He's one of the most respected DPs in the business. And so, I'd say with building your team, it's about trusting your eye for talent and bringing people into the fold and treating them with respect and paying them properly, right? That's what we all want. And then it builds your network.
Totally. We have another question, and this one is from my nephew, actually, Alexander Moll, who's in Vancouver. So he wasn't able to see the film, but he wants to know, what are Angela's views on the film, and was she satisfied with the end result?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Yes. So Angela, true to form as an academic, it took almost 2 years to talk her into letting me do this and interview her, right? And with that, I got access to all the other people. But she was not involved in the process. So she was like a graduate advisor, right? And at a certain point, I promised her I would show her the cut, be surprised, opening at the Toronto International Film Festival. So I flew out to Oakland, where she is, and arranged for her to meet me. She came in her yoga outfit. She was off to, she's going to go do her yoga after. And we sat in this room, in a dark room, and I pressed play. And from the moment the first images come up, her foot started to rattle, like,
nervously.
Yeah, nervously. And she rocked a little bit, exactly. And I'm sitting behind her, right? This is the trick we all know in the film. So I can watch her and the screen, because I'd seen the film already. And she's having a response to seeing what is to her home movies. So I realized at that moment, precisely in a true way, she doesn't know her story because she was in jail for most of it. So she heard about her sister out there in France and going all across the world, but she never saw the footage. Ifania Davis. She heard about all the press and the craziness outside the courtroom, but she didn't always see it, right? And so this was a way for her to kind of distance and see what happened. And I think, at the end, she was like, "Oh, it's not terrible." Wow. That was not as long as I thought it was going to be. And what that grew into as other people saw it, right? And they you know, her family didn't really understand who she was, and they didn't have these memories. And so what the footage and the interviews with the music does is it provides you with a memory of a moment that wasn't yours. And her nieces and nephews were just like, thank you. And so that's what I wanted. I wanted, you know, for those of us that didn't live through the moment to feel like we were there, so that we could take it away and it could be in our emotional memory, our historical memory. And then for others, you know what I mean? Have some historical imagination about our greatness.
Absolutely.
Right?
On a very practical note, and this is like thinking back to what happened to Eyes on the Prize and Black Side and losing the copyright. And I know Ford Foundation, I believe it was that stepped in. Are we going to be able to see Free Angela and our political prisoners in perpetuity?
In perpetuity. Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Thank you for that question. That was one of the things that I learned. You know, I came out of graduate school with a master's in American history and public history resource management. You know, I wanted to be a curator in a historical institution. I'm a filmmaker today because I landed a job with a filmmaker because I couldn't land a job in a historical institute, in any of the cultural institutions in the city. And I worked for Ken Burns at Florentine Films on and he PBS, you know, documentarian, historical documentarian.
He's the one everybody knows.
Yes, he's the one that everybody knows, and he's very good at the business. So his point of view of the world is not mine. That's my responsibility. So you learn from those situations. I was there for 4 years, almost 5 years, and I learned that you have to own your work, right? And you have to, when you're licensing, if you're going to do it and take the time to make these films, you want them to be available for the life of the film. And so we focused that way.
Yeah, and I threw that out there without giving much context. What I was referring to is the fact that the documentary series Eyes on the Prize, the absolutely brilliant documentary series Eyes on the Prize, that was produced, I think, in the 80s, reached a point where they were unable to continue to distribute the film, to show the film, because the license on the footage they had, some of it had run out, and the Ford Foundation, I believe, had kind of like came in and saved it, because it is the record of the civil rights, you know, on film, basically.
Yes, of American civil rights. It is the best oral history of that period. Everybody was interviewed. It was directed by Henry Hampton. Right. And, you know, and Orlando Bagwell, who was at the Ford Foundation at the time, had worked with Henry Hampton on subsequent series. And so it was that sense of, yes, these are our stories and they're important to share. And when he was in the position of power to be able to fund it, did. That's what, you know, we need our voices and perspective in every layer of this business.
We have another question from Mariel, again, Brown. Mariel asks, it would be great to hear your thinking on film as a tool for activism. So kind of like, good segue. Was this one of your intentions?
Yes and no. I mean, yes. So the film is about activism. I think one of the things, so why Angela said yes is not because she wanted anybody to probe into her personal life. She, you know, and to tell the story.
It does go there too, yeah.
and it does go there because it's germane to the story at that time. These are the facts of her life at that time. But what she was interested in, the movement and how it came to be, and came to be victorious. And so, you know, it's something that maybe you all in the Caribbean and the Black diaspora and the majority Black countries may not feel in the same way. But in the United States, the stories about Blackness are about us losing. Nobly, graciously, with great songs sometimes, dance, you know what I mean? But they're not about us winning, right? Shirley Chisholm runs for president. She doesn't become the nominee, but what she does is important and noble, right? What is unnerving, I think, to parts of the United States, or some folks, is that Angela Davis and her team of brilliant lawyers, who are all people, primarily, not all, but people of color, they win. against the state. Yet she's remembered still today as guilty.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that for me, I realized exactly how little I knew about Angela Davis when I saw the film. And granted, I was an infant when most of this happened, and there was no internet and whatnot. So being able to access that story was pretty incredible. And that's, as you say, that's what films are for, and that's what historical documentary is for.
Yes, yes. So I would also add, though, sorry to interrupt you, Georgia, but I think one of the things that made her a target also saved her. That her parents were not communists, but they were connected to labor movements. And growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, they worked against segregation, which meant that they were, quote unquote, against the government, right?
Yeah.
So she comes up in an environment where her parents live activism in a quiet, behind the scenes way, but important way. And so when she becomes of age and she's trying to figure out where she fits in the American political scene, she chooses to become a communist, well, part of the Black and Brown collective within the Communist Party. And that's the thing that gets her into trouble with the then governor, Ronald Reagan. He's like, not on my watch. He'd come up during McCarthy's era, and the idea of a communist was like, that's an anti-American. But if you listen to what she's saying and what they were all saying in the collective and really in the Black Power movement, it's not anti-American. It's more, it is holding America a democracy, right? That's the most American thing you can do, to me. Yeah.
Right.
So the movement.
Yeah, which is the reasoning of the Roger McAfee, the farmer who bails her out, who posts a bail. His reasoning is that she is doing, defending kind of, the ideals of the American Constitution by doing what she's doing. Like, super interesting. There seems to be a question coming in. Where can persons living abroad, I guess that means outside of Trinidad and Tobago, see the film?
Sure. It was distributed. So we had an amazing reception to the film, and we premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival. And then we were in theaters in France for 6 months. We were in theaters in the US, about 9 cities, and in Sweden and in Brazil. And then, that was pretty much it. And it exists in streaming services through iTunes and Amazon, in the US for sure. And if there's interest in other countries, I am happy to have it properly distributed. Any distributors out there interested, I'm ready.
Hear that? Take note, distributors. I have seen kind of like, not complaints, but comments on social media. Certainly at the beginning, because I have since seen that Angela Davis is becoming more visible now in this moment, and is actually engaging kind of like directly with the kind of the Black Lives Matter movement and speaking with them. But there was this complaint that because Angela Davis wasn't on social media, the kind of power of her ideas wasn't being transmitted. Have you been seeing her kind of showing up, like maybe even more than I have? There are a few YouTube videos of her talking. She's done open Democracy Now! Interviews and whatnot, but is she kind of like, involved?
That she's always been involved. It's whether people are listening. And I think that what's happened is, she's always been involved. Her speaking schedule is incredible. When she was a professor, now she's retired, and she was traveling more all over the world to give talks and lectures and hold seminars, and those things are increasingly filmed and then shared. She's one. It's so admirable the way she has been consistent. The film ends in 1972, but she has lived her life since then, engaged in movements that matter to her. And they're, you know, anti-racism, anti-prison. Let's make the world a better place. It sounds so, and not in a Pollyanna way, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah,
it is, in a sense, her practice, right?
and she's also a globalist, an internationalist, which of course is a tenet of Marxism. But in the Democracy Now! Interview, she's talking about, you know, the killing of the Brazilian activist Marielle Forbes, Marielle, not Forbes. Sorry, Marielle Forbes is from Bocas. Marielle Franco in Brazil, and her kind of the global perspective is actually what we've also seen now with the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, becoming global. So
absolutely,
that I think, without people even realizing it, is a current that's kind of, you know, probably been there, that hasn't been identified, but it's definitely what we're, and anti-colonialism, of course, very strong.
Absolutely,
in her work.
Yes, the diaspora is something that is real and tangible, and she's connected to. And one of her favorite words is intersectionality, right?
Probably using it long before it was
totally
recognized.
absolutely. And you know, and then there's the phrase that came out of the Free Angela movement and the anti-prison prison work, you know, this idea of critical resistance. And that's a phrase that she applied to prisons and wrote about. But I think that's a phrase that is important for anybody in any movement, that it is about maintaining your stamina for longevity around critical resistance. That is the only way that change happens. It's not one rally and done. It's not a few years and like, I got kids now. You know, it's finding ways to make sure that critical resistance is part of how you live your life.
Yeah. Shola, if Angela Davis had said to you, "You have my blessing to do the film, but I don't want to be interviewed," would you have still made the film?
No.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. I mean, let's look at history. How many women's voices do we have that we carry with us? You know, my work is about making visible not just Black history and Black voices, but women's voices in particular, women of color, and to make visible our timeline and legacy. We should know where we come from, and that we don't exist in a vacuum, and that our stories may or may not have been publicized or told, but often, not always, they're archived. And the archives become a place of real, you know, for me, critical resistance, right? Because it's a way of going back and digging in and unearthing. So the exploration is not just looking forward. Exploration is also about looking back and pulling out the stories that we overlooked, and casting them in a new light. And that's what I take pride in. I think it helps us in our current moments. It helps us feel a sense of legacy, but it also helps the broader culture have a better sense of historical imagination about our offerings and our intellect, and, you know, beyond the kind of constriction of stereotyping.
Yeah, and it is hard to imagine the film without her in it. And in fact, on the second viewing, I remember having the impression in 2013 that there was less of Angela today in the film. Her, you know, the kind of contemporary interview, so to speak. And I suddenly realized, well, you know, she actually carries the, you know, there's of course no narration, but if there is anything that's close to a kind of thread, it is her kind of, you know, impressions and opinions of the moment. So yeah, I guess it would have been kind of like, it would have been a very different film. And I think it's to your credit that you say you wouldn't attempt it without her, because there of course are documentaries using just archive where a filmmaker attempts to kind of like, editorialize or imagine the narrative. But I for one, I think it's like, it's so central to the film to have her there.
Yeah, but I will say that that was possible because she wasn't trying to control the narrative. I mean, she really trusted me. And in fact, if I hadn't have made the film on Shirley Chisholm, which, her assistant at the time was really helpful in helping me get her to even watch it. Because what would happen is the stack of requests would be like this high. And her assistant would take it from the bottom, my letter and whatever, and keep putting it on the top. And when she finally watched the film, what she said to me is, I learned something. I thought I knew that story about Shirley Chisholm running for president, and I learned something. And she realized that was what was possible in how I would approach. My father's a history professor, retired emeritus from Columbia University, et cetera, of that generation where he can swing very nicely from Trinidadian to Tobagonian patois to a good stiff British accent, right? He's not on social media, so I can say this. Right?
He's what they call Afro-Saxon.
Yes. And I say that with all love. And so it's not in my DNA to not be accurate, right? And so she could sense that, and that was what the objective was in terms of the storytelling, to be accurate, but to make it emotionally true, so that she could watch it and say, that's what I felt, right? But then other folks, those of us who weren't in the moment, could watch it and feel that truth.
Good. We have a question. This might be from Chanel herself, because it's not tagged. The question is, I've learned so much from this film. It's also answered a lot of questions for me around the identity of justice. Are there any other stories from strong women of color from history that you would like to tell?
So many, so little time.
Big ones. So yeah, who else would be on your list?
Yeah. Well, actually, I have almost finished a piece on an athlete for ESPN on Flojo. Do you remember Florence Griffith Joyner? Right? Yeah. Who is exactly. Who's still the world record holder in the 100 and 200. And her story has kind of been silenced by her estate and silenced by, the complicated nature of track in the 80s. And so trying to bring that out into the world and get, and give a sense of her voice. I'm working on an art piece for an arts organization in New York called The Armory to celebrate 100 years of American women's suffrage and all that's complicated around that. And then my list is long in terms of both the docs and also facilitating movie narrative versions that have a sense of historical accuracy and truth and that are still amazing. Like, I would love to help bring this story to the big screen in terms of that, or even Shirley Chisholm's, that knowing all the details and being able to help translate that into a narrative movie would even broaden the interest in our stories.
Absolutely. Shirley Chisholm wasn't she also the first female presidential candidate? Wasn't anyone before her?
Well, she was the first to run for one of the two major parties. So there had been third-party candidates, but for the Democratic nomination. And, her family comes from Barbados, Caribbean strong all across the board, right? And, what gets overlooked in her story about that run for president is 1972, most women in the United States could not apply for a credit card without having her husband vouch for her or consent. That, the idea of a single working woman was very considered odd. And here was this Black woman running for president. And it wasn't a joke. And she actually had a very sound political strategy, So we get underestimated all the time.
Every day, exactly.
Yeah.
And the slogan "Unbought and Unbossed," which I've seen others kind of borrowing. When we did the rehearsal for this, you noted that that is not something that anyone probably could claim they are in 2020.
Yeah, that 72 was pretty amazing because corporations had not taken over politics in quite the same way. Shirley Chisholm had been a school teacher and then an administrator before she ran for state assembly and then Congress. She ran her presidential campaign largely on her savings.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, as a school teacher and administrator, is it even possible to have savings today? The cost of living is so outrageous, right? So number one, number two, the cost of campaigns mean you have to raise money from corporate interests. And as soon as you take money from corporate interests, you are not unbought and unbossed. I don't care who you are. Yeah. So her kind of candidacy is not possible in this political climate. I'd say that's probably the same all across, right?
Sadly.
So, yes. But in Trinidad, you all are doing pretty well in terms of representation by women in government. We've had a real
prime minister. We have a slew of members of parliament. And members of cabinet. Yeah, it's not bad. Always room for improvement, though.
Absolutely,
as we know. Shola, could you tell? Coming close to the end, but could you talk a bit about your work at the Schomburg?
Sure. It takes me back to the archives. I've come full circle. So, the job I would have wanted out of graduate school is to be on track for the job that I have now. And so what's so interesting is my film work is telling historical stories and creating in a sense, the archive around a historical story. I became one of the experts on Shirley Chisholm's run for president, right? And also quite an expert on Angela Davis's life in this period and the movement and the trial and then the acquittal, right? That happens in 1972. And so after the film was completed, I was trying to figure out how to connect with an institution, either to teach or then I heard about this position being opened at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And that's the state of mind, like to be in a space where every day is Black history in the United States, right, is a tremendous pleasure, right? And so my job is to care for literally the voices, the audio, and for the moving image, the movements of Black history and culture, and to make sure that they're unhidden. And I of course, do that with my colleagues. So it's not just me alone. We have a team in the division and then my colleagues at the Schomburg, and we're part of the New York Public Library, which means we have access to resources. So yeah, I'm always rallying for our voices.
Absolutely. And are you seeing, I think, young filmmakers coming in and making use of, wanting to make use of the footage that's there and kind of ferreting through and, doing what you've been doing actually with your films?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting about our historical stories is that most of the footage is in corporate hands, right? So for Free Angela,
and
footage
networks and whatnot, right?
The networks and so on. And it's footage that they're not necessarily interested in, don't know they have. So what you're able to do as a researcher, I can't tell you how many times we found the footage we were looking for in like miscellaneous Black women, folder or reel or whatever. And there would be Angela and Fania and Kathleen Cleaver, kind of like women with afros, like some of the footage in the film, so we got very good about knowing dates and looking for dates because people are usually great on dates and in these archives that aren't thinking about women's history or Black history. And so we have to help them find our material. And so the work at the Schomburg is to take the collection in unprocessed, and we've been working on making it more and more. And as it is more and more visible, we will start to promote it more and more.
Fantastic. I have another question. Al says, someone who tuned in late is still asking about streaming in the UK. Can you ask Shola to mention it again? Can you give the information on where it's streaming again, Shola?
Yeah. So it's streaming on iTunes and Amazon, but I'm pretty sure it's only in the US. And so let me connect me with UK distributors. I'd be happy to have it distributed there in the UK. I think it's an important, at this moment in our global history around Black Lives Mattering and the movement, I think that it would have appeal, but that's one of the and that's one of the things in the business, though, is you deal with executives who are like, who's going to watch this? What? So, you're going to have, how old is Angela? So old people are going to be talking, like, who's going to watch this? And that's not the feeling. Like, you don't watch the film and think, okay, I'm watching senior citizens tell their story. No. This is the antithesis of what the energy around the movement is, and the intent of that political activism. And so, I'm telling you, the gatekeepers can be a little rough on us, those of us who want to tell these stories, but to be perseverant and to make it happen in the ways that we can. Because once they exist, look, there's audience, and we can start to prove that.
Totally.
Right. And I actually did an interview with a series, They've Got to Have Us, right? Which is a documentary that came out of England that's getting a lot of play on Netflix. And that's what that is all about, in a sense, both there in Europe, but also in the United States. Like, those of us who create work, we have to do it. I try to not, like, I can't tell you in the middle of making this film and you're like 4 or 5 and I don't have all the money, and there's always a moment where you doubt what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I look back on those moments, and I'm so glad I was able to get through them, because once it exists, it's a cultural artifact that is in the world that people can be in conversation with, and then nobody can take that away from you. These films that I make, directed and written by Shola Lynch, nobody can take that away, ever, right?
Yep.
Whether I'm here or not doesn't matter, right?
That's why we can look at films from the early 20th century still, for better or for worse sometimes.
For better or for worse, exactly.
Well, we are actually at the end. We have like 1 minute to go, and I am getting the so-called wind-up signal from ttff. Shola, this has been a pleasure to talk to you again about this film. I'm looking forward to seeing the Floor Joe doc and all the other things you're doing.
Yeah, let's hope I can get it out of his legal troubles, right, and out into the world, right? But we forget she's the world record holder. Come on, let's not silence her.
Record holder, and you've done it before. So thank you. Congrats again on an absolutely wonderful film, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in today to the discussion as the TTFF concludes Watch a Movie on Us series, which is brought to you by the Trinidad and Tobago Festival in partnership with the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago. And a final reminder that Free Angela and All Political Prisoners is available to stream across the Caribbean until 11:15 p.m. tonight. And the film is an hour and 40 minutes, so tune in early enough so that you get to the end, because you will absolutely want to. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Festival guests. Bye.
Bye-bye.